Thank you for having me. My name is Rachel Wilson. I completed my PhD at Queen's University Belfast in 2013, and since then I've worked as a research fellow at the University of Leeds and as a lecturer in early modern history at Cardiff University, where I'm currently an honorary research fellow. My publications include my monograph, Elite Women in Ascendancy Ireland, 1690 to 1745, which came out with Boydell and Brewer in 2015. And most recently, a chapter in an edited volume. The chapter is entitled An Admirable Vice Queen, the Duchess of Rutland in Ireland, 1784 to 87. And the book is entitled Viceroys of Ireland, Portraits of Forgotten Women. And that was edited by Miles Campbell and came out with Irish Academic Press in 2021. The title of my paper today is An Education Fit for a Lady, Teaching Girls in the Big House in Ireland, circa 1690 to 1745. Suppose all the girls and women listening had a time machine. What would it take beyond a new wardrobe for them to pass themselves off for a day as a member of the female elite in Ireland if they went back to the late 17th and early 18th centuries? This talk will answer that question by delving into the education girls from the upper orders of Irish society received during that time, usually whilst living at one of the big houses dotted around Ireland, many of which can still be seen today, including Kilkenny Castle and Castletown House in County Kildare. When it came to educating their daughters, the Irish elite were heavily influenced by conduct literature. This was a genre of publications aimed at advising people how best to live their lives, with some of the better known authors of the period being Richard Alistry, John Locke, Barry Astle and Francois Fenelon. During the 1720s and 30s, Irish editions of the most popular education manuals read in England began appearing, and in 1740, Irishman Wetton Hall Wilkes published his Letter of Genteel and Moral Advice to a Young Lady, which was first printed in Dublin and was initially written for his niece. Look around the libraries of any 18th century stately homes you visit in Ireland today, and you might still see old copies of such books upon their shelves. The advice contained within them varied depending on how conservative or liberal the author was, but a girls' curriculum was demanding and, broadly speaking, comprised of two parts. The first might be called book learning or learning by rote and consisted of a combination of subjects, knowledge of which could be easily tested. If you were a young lady growing up in Ireland in this era, you could expect to be given a solid grounding in religion, the ability to raise children, manage accounts, and oversee the running of a great household and perhaps even estate. You would also become proficient in a selection of polite accomplishments. These included history, modern languages, music, and dancing. And if learned correctly, it was expected that you could show off these accomplishments at social events and even use them to attract a husband. The second part of the curriculum revolved around the idea of politeness or civility. This was far less easily quantified than book learning, but it was of the utmost importance if a girl wished to build and maintain a good reputation. It entailed having good deportment, a pleasing manner, and the ability to carry on a polite conversation. This subjective mix was best obtained through practice and guidance, and Letitia Bush, originally of County Kilkenny, cautioned one young female friend that the world whom you please by the advantage of your fortune, polite people by gentleness of your manners, others by the agreeableness of your person. An attention more general on your part for all sorts of people will fortify the whole world in the pleasure of saying good of you, and the good that will be said of you will even help to fix you the firmer in the possession of everything which can contribute to your honour. Wealth and status were not a sure path to success, nor a satisfactory replacement for good behaviour, and Letitia complained, unfairly I'm sure, that the people of Cork and Bristol were, quote, without any politeness, and instead valued their riches as if they were supplied by money with every valuable qualification of mind and body. When it came to conversational skills, the first volume of the Ladies' Library, which was compiled, despite what you see on the cover page here, by George Berkeley, later Bishop of Cloyne, and published in 1714, advised that a young lady should never speak but for necessity, and even then with diffidence and deference. She should never talk of things above the common reach of her age or sex, however she may be informed of them by the advantages of her quality and education. Her behaviour should be exact and regular, her temper even and orderly, her judgment just and upright, to know when to talk and when to be silent. Well, as sexist and patronising as this advice was, it was made all the more irritating by the fact that it conflicted with other demands placed upon women, which dictated that they should be able to adapt their behaviour to suit whatever company they were in. Mary Lady Shelburne, who was the daughter of a Kentish knight but who married a succession of Irish men and lived most of her life in Ireland, boasted in 1706 that she had never been accused of any fault in her manners, saying, "My education and conversation having always been such as would teach me how to behave myself towards all men." Yet this comment was made in response to accusations circulating amongst her acquaintance in Ireland that she had been, quote, "disrespectful or scurrilous in her correspondence with her absent husband's Scottish landlord," and in fact she had acted towards him in a very high-handed manner. Clearly, the image she wanted to portray didn't always match with that which was actually presented, though she apparently realised that it should have been, because she made what turned out to be a very bungled attempt at damage control by offering this half-hearted apology that was actually wrapped up in further insults. With sociability such a tricky feat to master, and a young girl's reputation and position within society dependent upon its acquisition, the choices of where to educate her and to whom to entrust her instruction were of critical importance. Female boarding schools were not popular amongst the higher ranks of the elite. Contemporary wisdom dictated that a school could not impart the same moral and social education as a parent, being more concerned with academic subjects. They were nevertheless deemed acceptable for boys because expectations of chastity were lower for them than for their sisters, and it was felt that they might need a strong academic grounding in order to pursue a career. Women in the early 18th century were also warned not to, quote, "take up the confidence, the boldness of men under a notion of good breeding," end quote. An idea which also appeared later in the century in the argument that schools were dangerous to girls unless they should give them too much confidence, thereby eroding their meek and pliable personalities. Once again, this drawback in a girl's education was seen as an advantage in a boy's, because he would have to make his way in the world. The expense of certain schools also ruled them out for those slightly lower down the social ladder with gentle rather than aristocratic backgrounds, but pretensions to more. The Reverend James Smith, writing from County Antrim, briefly entertained the idea of sending his daughter Anne to Dublin for a year, but had to abandon the plan when he realised the cost of the school in question. Nor could a school provide the kind of environment needed for certain types of situation-based learning, and here we see the importance of the big house as a locale for a girl's education. As Wetton Hall Wilkes pointed out, it was only at the family residence that a girl could undertake, quote, "part of the management of her mother's house," and thereby learn how to go through her domestic offices when she comes to one of her own, that's one of her own houses. For these reasons, her primary learning space was her home, and though professionals were brought in to teach particular skills, such as dancing, the person in overall charge of her learning was her mother. Should the mother be dead or unavailable for any reason, girls were instead sent to female relatives to be educated. Though advantageous in some ways, the success of homeschooling very much depended on the abilities and temperament of the mother or mother figure. Molly Burton, who you see here, was the great niece of Catherine Connolly, wife then widow of William Connolly, the Speaker of the Irish House of Commons, who died in 1729. The Connollys were arguably the richest couple in Ireland, and after being quasi-adopted by them as a small child, Molly grew up at their mansion Castletown House, which you saw at the beginning. Taught at home under the eye of her aunt, Molly was, according to Catherine, an excellent sewer, writer, dancer and musician. The problem was that here her education stopped. One of Catherine's sisters, Mary Jones, complained that she, meaning Molly, spends little of her time in the drawing room with company, but with the servants, and as great ado with her baby house as if she were but 7-year-old. I think this is strange education for a young lady near 14-year-old. Unlike Catherine, Mary could see that rather than being allowed to live her life in the nursery, interacting primarily with servants, by 13, Castletown's drawing room should have been Molly's schoolroom, and polite society her instructors, again drawing attention to the importance of the home as an educational setting as well as a residence. To understand how Miss Burton should have been trained in the social graces, we need look no further than Lady Mary Butler. Born a generation earlier, Lady Mary was the daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Ormond, who, like the Connollys, were the premier Irish family of their day. The Duke was twice Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and it was during his first term of office, between 1703 and 7, that the 13-year-old Mary opened the dancing at a ball in Dublin with the Earl of Abercorn. In so doing, she demonstrated not only excellent dancing skills, but also the kind of poise and confidence it is difficult to imagine Molly exhibiting at the same age. To ensure she was accepted and respected amongst her peer group, Catherine Connolly ought to have insisted that her great niece be exposed to the company of other women of a similar or higher rank, to whose manners, conversation, and conduct she should then have drawn her niece's attention, directing her in what to emulate and what to avoid. Instead, Mary Jones wrote, "There is no care taken of her education nor principles, and my sister makes no inquiries whether she tells her lies, which she does every day." As a result, Molly was spoilt and ill-mannered with an incomplete and therefore inferior education which didn't fit her for elite society. Her main problem was that her aunt wasn't a learned lady, and what had been fit for Catherine as the daughter of a knight in mid-17th century Ireland was nowhere near good enough for a lady of one of its wealthiest families 60 years later. Mrs. Connolly wasn't oblivious to the changed times, having subscribed to Wilkes's letter of genteel advice in 1740, but she took little care to set a good example for Molly and was ultimately unequal to the task of raising the child to be any more socially adept than herself. At the time of her death in 1752, Catherine was described as a plain and vulgar woman in her manner, and like her great niece, prone to fits of rudeness and lying. With an almost total disregard for what others thought of her, it was Catherine's failure to recognise the extent of her own limitations which blinded her to Molly's. For some, there was the opportunity to finish their education outside their home, though still within a series of big houses. While the extended holiday around Europe, known as the Grand Tour, which boys took at the end of their schooling, wasn't an option for girls, they might instead make visits to Dublin or even London to be Finnish and to learn the most fashionable etiquette. The wealthy County Tyrone heiress, Margaret Hamilton, who would later become Countess of Orrery, planned to travel to England for 6 months as soon as she was of age in 1732. And by so doing, wrote a famous female acquaintance, shows to the world her taste in going. This taste was rooted in the fact that the trip provided an opportunity not only for pleasure and to advertise her wealth and position, but to improve and refine the social graces she had already picked up in Ireland, and given that cosmopolitan flavour which was the mark of time spent in a great urban centre. England was the preferred place to obtain this educational polish, not only because of the novelty of leaving Ireland, but because of its larger, better established elite. Depending on her connections, a young lady could stay at and visit the homes of the English aristocracy and attend functions at the biggest house of them all, the royal court. These opportunities provided girls with the chance to perfect the biculturalism necessary to traverse both the English and Irish elites, while a spell in London was also the surest way to soften or even remove one of the clearest markers of a girl's Irishness, her native accent. A good accent, which was increasingly one which copied the received pronunciation of the English court, showed that a person moved in and belonged to polite society. Its acquisition by Irish children caused many a headache for their parents, however. Elite boys could be expected to learn correct inflections at the English schools they were sent to, but it was often difficult in big houses in Ireland, particularly in rural areas, to find English people of a suitable rank for children to converse with, and the problem became another reason to send country girls to the city. James Smith, when writing of his daughter's education in 1728, told his brother that "it is impossible she can improve in this country except it be in the dialect of Scotland, for which reason I have thoughts of sending her soon to Dublin." For those with aspirations of high society, especially in England, it was worth the effort to correct this supposed defect, in quotes, for outsiders had a low tolerance for parochial accents. English writer and politician Horace Walpole, despite his otherwise disparaging remarks on the education of the poor but famously beautiful Gunning sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, who were born in England but raised in Ireland, admitted that their mother had at least ensured, quote, that they avoided the provincial brogue of their Irish neighbours, a measure of which he clearly approved. To conclude then, ladies, you're going to need to be a good all-rounder if you find yourself in the Ireland of 300 years ago and hope to blend in with the upper crust. Start polishing off your sewing, musical and language skills, consider elocution lessons, and make sure you've read the latest books so that you have something to talk about during drawing room gatherings and at dinner parties and balls in your own big house and beyond. Of course, you'll have to navigate a tricky social situation in which blatant sexism is an accepted way of life, and some people will want you to talk while others won't. If you'd like to escape an especially dull conversation, you may have the opportunity to put your dancing skills to the test and it's important you don't neglect these before you hop in your time machine. In March 1734, a young woman known only to us as Miss Allen attended a ball at Dublin Castle. During the course of the evening, she, quote, undertook to amuse the audience by dancing the Britain. Unfortunately, according to the same source, she could not dance a step of it and was forced to leave off in the middle, but nobody was sorry for her, for she is much hated by everyone for her impertinent behaviour. Though now long dead, Miss Allen's failure that evening, both in her dancing and in her manners, has now endured for nearly 3 centuries. A cautionary tale, if ever there was one, that to make it in the elite, you needed to have an education fit for a lady. Thank you.